In the quiet suburbs of Colorado, a family harbored a secret that would baffle medical science for generations to come. The Galvin household, seemingly normal on the outside, concealed America's most disturbing genetic mystery within its walls. What happened behind closed doors in 1951 would forever change our understanding of hereditary mental illness. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the crisp autumn of 1945, Mimi Galvin crossed the threshold of her new home on Hidden Valley Road, her fingers trembling with equal parts excitement and trepidation. The Colorado sunshine streamed through spotless windows, casting golden rectangles across freshly waxed floors that gleamed with promise. She inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of polish and possibility, silently offering prayers that this house would cradle the perfect life she'd always envisioned. Don Galvin stood rigidly by the doorway, his military posture never faltering even in this domestic setting. His eyes methodically scanned the empty rooms, already mapping out where discipline and order would reign. "This is it, Mimi," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man accustomed to command. "Everything we've worked for." The moving truck arrived shortly after, disgorging furniture and boxes that would transform the empty shell into their sanctuary. Mimi directed the placement of each item with precision, her faith in God and family as unwavering as her determination to create a home worthy of admiration. When the movers left, she spent hours arranging picture frames and smoothing tablecloths until every surface reflected her meticulous standards. By the end of that first week, their eldest son, Donald Galvin Jr., was already claiming territory in the backyard, his childish laughter echoing against the pristine walls. The boy's energy seemed boundless as he explored every corner of their new kingdom, leaving tiny fingerprints that Mimi diligently wiped away each evening. "Children need structure," Don reminded her during dinner, cutting his meat with military precision. "That's how we'll build something special here." Mimi nodded, already envisioning Sunday masses, neighborhood barbecues, and a home filled with more children, the living embodiment of American success. Each morning, she rose before dawn to polish and prepare, her hands red from cleaning solutions, but her spirit buoyed by unwavering optimism. When little Donald knocked over a glass of milk, she cleaned it without complaint, convinced that every mess could be scrubbed away, every challenge overcome through sheer force of will. At night, after Don had fallen asleep, Mimi would sometimes stand in the hallway, listening to her son's gentle breathing and imagining the siblings who would join him. She pictured them racing through these halls, filling the house with joyful noise and achievement. In these quiet moments, she allowed herself to believe that happiness was something she could orchestrate through faith and determination, like a conductor leading a perfect symphony. What she couldn't know was how this house on Hidden Valley Road would eventually contain far more than she had bargained for. 12 children whose lives would unfold in ways she could never have imagined on that hopeful autumn day. By 1955, the Galvin household had transformed from a hopeful young couple's dream into a bustling hub of activity. Mimi Galvin gave birth with clockwork regularity, her Catholic faith prohibiting any intervention in God's plan for her family. The children arrived one after another, filling the Colorado home with the chaos of youth, 10 boys with crew cuts and scraped knees, followed by 2 girls who became precious jewels in their mother's crown. Sunday mornings found the family occupying an entire pew at church, a parade of pressed shirts and polished shoes that drew admiring glances from the congregation. Mimi beamed with pride as neighbors whispered about her remarkable ability to manage such a brood with apparent ease. Don nodded solemnly at compliments, his military bearing never faltering, even surrounded by his children. "The Galvins are what America should be," the parish priest once remarked, unaware of what transpired behind closed doors. Afternoons echoed with the rhythmic thud of boxing gloves in the backyard. Don insisted on the sport, believing it would instill discipline in his sons. "A man must know how to defend himself and his family," he would say, watching with approval as the older boys taught the younger ones to stand with fists raised. Donald Jr. showed particular promise, his movements precise and controlled, earning rare smiles from his father. The kitchen remained Mimi's domain, where she orchestrated meals for 14 with military precision. Her hands moved constantly, chopping, stirring, serving, cleaning, a perpetual motion that kept the household functioning. The children learned quickly to clear their plates and mind their manners under her watchful eye. But when darkness fell and Don was away for training exercises, a different Mimi emerged. After tucking in the last child, she would return to the kitchen, pulling out scrub brushes and cleanser. For hours, she would attack invisible stains on the already gleaming floor, her knuckles white with effort. "Just a bit more," she would whisper to herself. "Or just a bit cleaner." The silence of those nights pressed against her like a physical weight. Something unnamed lurked at the edges of her perfect world, a shadow in Donald Jr.'s eyes, sometimes, a moment too long before James would answer a question, the way little Matthew rocked himself to sleep. These observations she buried deep, scrubbing harder, as if to erase not just dirt, but doubt itself. Each year, as the family portrait grew wider with new additions, the unease grew alongside it. Still, Mimi smiled for the camera, straightened shoulders, and silenced the voice inside that whispered something was terribly wrong. The Galvin family's passion for falconry began when Don Galvin brought home a majestic peregrine falcon from a military colleague. The powerful bird, with its piercing eyes and lethal talons, quickly became the centerpiece of family activities. Don taught his sons the ancient art with military precision, showing them how to train the predator to return to their gloved hands on command. For Mimi Galvin, watching her husband and sons work with the falcon brought rare moments of peace. She observed from the kitchen window as they stood in formation in the backyard, the bird soaring above before diving down in perfect obedience. The falcon represented everything she valued, wild power harnessed through discipline and unwavering faith. "See how even nature bends to consistent training," she would tell Margaret while preparing dinner, her hands working methodically on the vegetables. "God gives us challenges, but also the tools to overcome them." The boys competed for turns holding the training glove, with Donald Jr. often taking charge, instructing his younger brothers with the same authoritative tone their father used. These sessions became a ritual, bringing structure to the chaotic household of 10 boys and 2 girls. One crisp autumn afternoon, as clouds gathered over Hidden Valley Road, the family gathered in the yard for training. James, eager to impress his father, volunteered to hold the glove. The bird circled overhead, its wingspan casting a shadow across the neatly trimmed grass. What happened next would be recounted differently by each family member for years to come. The falcon descended too quickly, or perhaps James moved at the wrong moment. A piercing scream cut through the air as the bird's talons slashed across the boy's forearm, leaving deep gashes that immediately welled with blood. Don Galvin rushed forward, securing the bird while Mimi pulled James inside, pressing a kitchen towel against the wound. The other children stood frozen, watching crimson stain the pristine white cloth. "It's nothing," Mimi insisted, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "It's just a scratch." But the incident marked the end of falconry at the Galvin home. The bird was given to another military family, the training equipment stored away in the garage. In the weeks that followed, tension hung in the air like the approaching winter. The younger children whispered behind closed doors, trading theories about bad omens and family curses. The falcon knew. 6-year-old Lindsay confided to Margaret one night, their heads close together under shared blankets. Then it could see something wrong inside us. Margaret hushed her sister, but couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted that day, as if the falcon had torn not just skin, but the very fabric holding their family together. Donald Galvin Jr. had always been the beacon of the family's aspirations. At 17, his academic prowess was unmatched in Colorado Springs High School, earning him straight A's that made teachers smile with approval. On Sundays, when the family occupied their usual pew at St. Mary's, Mimi would watch with undisguised pride as her eldest led his brothers in perfect formation, their shoes polished and hair neatly combed. "Donald will attend the Air Force Academy," Mimi would tell the other mothers after Mass, her voice carrying just enough to ensure everyone heard. The oldest son had inherited his father's military bearing, but possessed a gentleness that made him the natural mediator among his siblings. When disputes arose during their boxing sessions in the backyard, it was Donald Jr. who restored order, his word respected by all. But during the winter of 1951, something shifted. The change was subtle at first: a missed dinner, homework left incomplete, a vacant stare during family prayer. By February, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The teenager who once commanded attention now spent hours sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, staring at the wall without blinking. His textbooks gathered dust on his desk. "Donald, sweetheart," Mimi would whisper, kneeling beside him, her hand light on his shoulder. "It's time for dinner." But her son remained unreachable, as though separated from her by an invisible barrier. His eyes, once bright with ambition, had grown dull and unfocused. Don Sr., when home from his military duties, suggested the boy was simply going through a phase. But Mimi recognized something more troubling in her son's silence. She responded the only way she knew how, by tightening her grip on the family structure. Bedtimes became non-negotiable, chores were assigned with military precision, and family dinners became mandatory affairs where each child reported their daily activities while Mimi watched Donald Jr. push food around his plate. "We need more discipline," she insisted during a rare private moment with her husband. "Structure will bring him back to us." She scrubbed the kitchen counters with increasing ferocity, as though she could erase her growing fear along with every stain. Yet the stricter the household became, the further Donald Jr. retreated. He stopped joining the falcon training sessions that had once been his passion. His brothers began to avoid him, unsettled by his vacant stares and occasional mumbling to unseen listeners. One evening, Mimi found him in the bathroom, scissors in hand, having cut jagged patterns into his own hair. When she reached for him, he flinched away. "They're watching through my hair," he whispered, the first complete sentence he'd spoken in weeks. That night, after the children were asleep, Mimi knelt beside her bed and prayed until her knees ached, tears streaming down her face. The perfect family she had cultivated with such care was beginning to crumble, and she had no idea how to hold the pieces together. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson peered over her garden fence one Tuesday afternoon, her brow furrowed with concern. The sounds coming from the Galvin residence had grown increasingly disturbing over the past few weeks. Raised voices, the crash of breaking glass, and what she could have sworn were muffled sobs in the dead of night. "Today, is everything all right over at your place, Tamimi?" she finally asked, when she spotted Mimi Galvin collecting mail from her immaculate mailbox. Mimi's smile appeared instantly, practiced and unwavering. "Why, of course. You know how boys can get, always roughhousing. 10 of them under one roof makes for quite the commotion." 3 days later, elegant handwritten invitations appeared in the mailboxes of every neighbor on Hidden Valley Road. The Galvins would be hosting a summer barbecue that weekend. A perfect opportunity to enjoy this beautiful Colorado weather together. the cards read in Mimi's meticulous script. Behind closed doors, Mimi gathered her children in the living room. Her instructions were crystal clear and delivered with quiet intensity. "Donald," she addressed her eldest son, using his full name deliberately. "You will help your father with the grill? No wandering off. No staring into space." She moved down the line of children. "James, you'll serve drinks with a smile. Margaret, you'll help me in the kitchen. The rest of you will play normally. No fighting, no crying, nothing unusual. Do you understand?" The children nodded silently, recognizing the steel beneath their mother's calm demeanor. On Saturday, the Galvin backyard transformed into a picture of suburban perfection. Don manned the grill with military precision, flipping burgers while exchanging pleasantries about baseball scores. The aroma of charcoal and sizzling meat mingled with laughter as neighbors sipped cold drinks from glasses that never emptied, thanks to James's vigilant service. "Such well-behaved children," Mrs. Thompson remarked to another neighbor, watching the Galvin boys play an organized game of catch. Perhaps I was mistaken. Margaret worked tirelessly alongside her mother, arranging platters of food with the same exacting standards Mimi demanded. The young girl's eyes occasionally darted to her brothers, monitoring for any signs of trouble. Only Lindsay, still too young to fully understand the performance, noticed how her mother's hands trembled slightly as she arranged deviled eggs on a silver platter. The child observed the deepening lines around Mimi's eyes, the tightness in her jaw, as she maintained her perfect hostess smile. As the afternoon wore on, Mimi cleared spotlessly clean plates from tables, her practiced smile never faltering. The facade held perfectly, a masterclass in appearances. Yet beneath her composed exterior, a storm was brewing, one that no amount of neighborhood barbecues could forever conceal. The transition from the pristine 50s to the tumultuous 60s brought subtle but unmistakable changes to the Galvin household. What had once been dismissed as boyish roughhousing took a darker turn one autumn afternoon in 1959. The familiar sound of boxing gloves connecting with flesh in the backyard suddenly transformed into something more sinister, shouts of alarm rather than excitement. Mimi Galvin rushed outside to find her sons huddled around one of the younger boys, blood streaming from a gash above his eye where a boxing glove had connected with unexpected force. The other brothers stood frozen, their faces masks of horror as crimson stained the collar of their brother's white shirt. "Inside." "Now," Mimi commanded, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, applying pressure until the bleeding stopped, then neat butterfly bandages to hold the skin together. No hospital visits, those invited questions, documentation, outside eyes peering into their private world. Later that evening, Mimi pulled Margaret Galvin aside in the kitchen while preparing dinner. "Keep your sister away from the boys when they're boxing," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. "Lindsay doesn't need to see such things." Margaret, only 14 but already shouldering responsibilities beyond her years, nodded solemnly. She understood the unspoken command: protect the youngest, preserve what innocence remained in their increasingly chaotic home. The eldest daughter quickly became her mother's shadow, learning to prepare meals for 12 hungry mouths, to iron shirts with military precision, to spot clean carpets before stains could set. While other girls her age practiced dance steps or giggled over magazines, Margaret memorized recipes and cleaning techniques, becoming a second mother to her siblings. Don Galvin's presence grew increasingly rare. Military duties called him away more frequently, or so he claimed. The truth hung unspoken between husband and wife. He found solace in the ordered world of his profession, where commands were followed without question and problems had clear solutions. The unpredictable atmosphere at home left him adrift, unable to apply his training to the situation unfolding under his own roof. In the evenings, Margaret would slip into Lindsay's room. The two sisters huddled together on the narrow bed. They whispered secrets and fears in the darkness, forming a bond that sustained them both. Margaret would brush Lindsay's hair with gentle strokes, humming softly. "We'll always have each other," Margaret promised one night, her voice barely audible above the muffled sounds of their brothers arguing downstairs. Lindsay nodded against her sister's shoulder. Too young to fully comprehend the gravity of their situation, but old enough to recognize the sanctuary they'd created together, a small island of calm in their increasingly turbulent home. Donald Galvin Jr. had once been the pride of Colorado Springs, but his first year at college revealed troubling changes. His roommate noticed him sitting motionless for hours, staring at walls as if they contained messages only he could see. The eldest Galvin son would sometimes vanish for days, returning disheveled and confused, with no explanation for his absence. The autumn bonfire was meant to be a celebration of campus spirit. Students gathered in the crisp night air, their faces glowing orange in the firelight as they sang school songs and passed bottles between cupped hands. Donald stood apart from the crowd, unnaturally still amid the revelry. Without warning, he suddenly sprinted toward the towering flames. Several students screamed as he leapt directly into the fire, disappearing momentarily in a shower of sparks. When he emerged seconds later, his hands were badly burned, his clothes singed and smoking, yet his face bore an unsettling smile, as if he'd discovered some profound truth in the heart of the inferno. "The voices told me to cleanse myself," he whispered to a horrified classmate who tried to help him. After that night, he refused to speak at all, maintaining a disturbing silence for nearly a week. Word spread quickly across campus. Students who had once admired the handsome, athletic freshman now crossed to the other side of walkways when they saw him coming. His professors noticed his vacant stares during lectures, his increasingly bizarre writings filled with paranoid ramblings about cosmic surveillance and divine messages. Back in Hidden Valley Road, Mimi Galvin received a telephone call from the university. She listened with white knuckles gripping the receiver, her face a mask of composure even as her world crumbled further. After hanging up, she spent 3 hours scrubbing the already spotless kitchen floor. "Donald is just going through a phase," she told the neighbors when they inquired about her eldest. "College can be so stressful these days." But she felt their scrutiny intensifying, saw the whispers behind cupped hands at church gatherings. The community that had once envied the perfect Galvin family now regarded them with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Rumors about something wrong with those Galvin boys began circulating through Colorado Springs. Mimi responded by hosting an elaborate dinner party, every detail immaculate, every smile practiced to perfection. She spoke brightly of Donald's academic achievements, carefully omitting any mention of the incident. Meanwhile, the young man himself remained at school, drifting further from reality with each passing day. Don Galvin buried himself in military duties, avoiding conversations about his namesake. The remaining children watched their mother's desperate performance, learning that in the Galvin household, appearances mattered more than truth, even as the truth became impossible to hide. James Galvin stood in front of his bathroom mirror, knuckles white against the porcelain sink. The whispers had started again, faint at first, like radio static between stations, then clearer, more insistent. They told him his wife was unfaithful, plotting against him with neighbors, colleagues, perhaps even his brothers. "She's lying to you," the voice hissed. "Everyone knows but you." James had married Ellen just 18 months earlier in a ceremony Mimi had orchestrated to perfection. The wedding was meant to be proof that the Galvin name wasn't tainted, that at least one son could lead a normal life. Ellen, with her patient smile and steady hands, had seemed like salvation, someone who didn't know about Donald Jr., his episodes, or the growing concerns about the other brothers. "I heard her on the telephone," James told his brother Matthew during a rare moment of clarity. "She was whispering, laughing. When I walked in, she hung up immediately." His voice trembled as he spoke, eyes darting to the corners of the room as if searching for eavesdroppers. The paranoia infected everything. Dinner conversations became interrogations. "Who called today?" he would demand, studying Ellen's face for signs of deception. "Why was the mailman at the door so long?" Normal interactions twisted into evidence of conspiracy. One evening, Ellen found her personal letters opened, spread across their bed like an accusation. When confronted, James flew into a rage that left their apartment in shambles, picture frames shattered, chairs overturned. The neighbors called Don and Mimi after hearing the commotion. Mimi arrived first, her face a mask of composure as she surveyed the destruction. She helped Ellen clean while James sat motionless in the corner, mumbling to himself. When Ellen suggested seeking medical help, Mimi's response was swift and final. "Every marriage has difficulties," she insisted. "Scrubbing at a stain on the carpet. You need to work these things out yourselves. The doctors don't understand our family." What Mimi didn't say was that another diagnosis would confirm what neighbors already suspected, that something was terribly wrong with the Galvin boys. The thought of another son labeled with schizophrenia was unbearable. Ellen tried for months after that, walking on eggshells in her own home, hiding her tears from her increasingly unstable husband. James's delusions grew more elaborate, his accusations more vicious. He began following her to work, convinced she was meeting lovers during lunch breaks. When Ellen finally left, packing a small suitcase while James was visiting his parents, Mimi told the family she'd abandoned her vows. The truth, that James had become dangerous, unpredictable, remained buried beneath layers of denial and shame. The Galvin secret grew heavier, a weight pressing down on every member of the family, crushing truth and hope beneath its terrible mass. Christmas Eve, 1963. Snow blanketed Hidden Valley Road as Mimi Galvin arranged her finest china with trembling hands. The house gleamed with holiday perfection, pine garlands draped across the mantel, candles casting warm light over polished surfaces. Outside, Colorado's winter painted the world white, while inside, tension simmered beneath forced smiles. "Everyone at the table in 5 minutes," Mimi called, her voice carrying that familiar edge of command. The children filtered in reluctantly, Donald Jr. last to arrive, his eyes distant and unfocused. Don Galvin sat at the head of the table, military straight despite the whiskey glass already half empty beside his plate. The meal began with prayer, 12 heads bowed in practiced unison. For 20 minutes, the facade held, plates passed, compliments on the roast exchanged. Margaret helping her mother serve, while Lindsay watched the proceedings with wary eyes. The sisters exchanged glances across the table, their silent language perfected through years of shared vigilance. "Could you pass the potatoes?" James asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the careful quiet. Donald Jr. froze, fork suspended mid-air. "They're listening," he whispered, eyes darting to the window. "They're always listening." "Not tonight," Mimi pleaded. Napkin clutched in her fist. "Please, not tonight." But the delicate peace shattered when Donald Jr. suddenly stood, knocking over his chair. "You're all pretending," he shouted, pointing accusingly at his father. "He knows what they're planning." Don Galvin slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal. "Sit down and control yourself." What followed was chaos. Donald Jr. grabbed a serving dish and hurled it across the room. Glass exploded against the wall as James lunged at his brother. Bodies collided, chairs toppled, and the younger boys scattered in terror. Margaret pulled Lindsay under the table, shielding her sister's eyes as their brothers' fists connected with sickening thuds. "Stop it!" Mimi screamed, but her voice drowned in the cacophony of breaking dishes and shouting. A neighbor, hearing the commotion, called the authorities. 20 minutes later, red and blue lights pulsed through the frosted windows, casting eerie shadows across the dining room's devastation. After the police left, taking Donald Jr. with them for observation, Mimi knelt on the kitchen floor, scrubbing at bloodstains that had seeped between the tiles. Tears streamed silently down her face as she worked, shoulders heaving with each breath. Don Galvin sat alone in the living room, staring into his refilled glass. The Christmas tree lights blinked in the corner, illuminating a family portrait taken just 2 years earlier. Smiling faces, pressed clothes, not a hint of the storm brewing beneath. The Galvin legacy of perfection had finally begun to crumble, and nobody knew how to pick up the pieces. Margaret Galvin sat on the edge of her bed, fingers nervously twisting the hem of her skirt as she watched her sister brush her hair. The house had been quiet for 3 hours now, a rare blessing in the Galvin household. "Sometimes I feel like I'm in prison," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic strokes of the hairbrush. "Hidden Valley Road sounds pretty, but these walls—" She gestured around their shared bedroom, the only space that felt remotely safe. Lindsay paused mid-stroke, her eyes meeting her sister's in the mirror. For a moment, neither spoke. They'd learned early that silence was often safer than words in this house. Then, with a furtive glance toward the door, the younger girl slid off her chair and knelt beside her bed. "I've been planning something," Lindsay confessed, reaching beneath her mattress. She pulled out several envelopes and pamphlets, spreading them across the floral bedspread. "College applications. 3 states away." Margaret's eyes widened as she examined the colorful university brochures. "How long have you been hiding these?" 6 months, Lindsay replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "I talked to my guidance counselor about scholarships. She thinks I have a real chance." Outside their room, the familiar sound of their mother's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Mimi Galvin's relentless cleaning routine had become as predictable as clockwork, a desperate attempt to scrub away troubles that no amount of polish could fix. "What about me?" Margaret asked, her voice catching. At 17, she was 2 years older than Lindsay, but felt decades older, worn down by the responsibility of being the buffer between her brother's unpredictable behavior and her younger sister. Lindsay grabbed her hand. "We'll figure it out, I promise." Her eyes, though similar to their father's, yet lacking Don Galvin's emotional distance, held a determination that Margaret hadn't seen in any of their brothers. "When I get settled, you can join me." That night, as moonlight filtered through curtains that had witnessed too many family secrets, the sisters made a pact. They whispered promises of protection and escape, creating a fragile alliance against the chaos that threatened to consume them both. "No matter what happens with the boys," Margaret murmured, "we look out for each other." Lindsay nodded solemnly. "Always." Their whispered covenant felt sacred in a house where faith had become complicated. The sisters fell asleep holding hands across the narrow gap between their beds, their dreams filled with possibilities beyond Hidden Valley Road. This alliance, forged in whispers and sealed with sisterly devotion, became their most precious possession, a sliver of hope in a household where hope had become a dangerous luxury, as fragile and forbidden as the truth itself. The call came at 3 in the morning. Donald Galvin Jr. had smashed every mirror in his apartment, convinced that demons were watching him through the glass. When the police arrived, they found him huddled in a corner, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds, muttering about surveillance and betrayal. This time, there would be no quiet cover-up, no family solution behind closed doors. At Colorado Springs Memorial Hospital, Mimi Galvin sat rigid in an uncomfortable chair, rosary beads clicking between her fingers as doctors delivered the diagnosis: paranoid schizophrenia. The clinical term hung in the sterile air, giving name to the shadow that had been stalking her firstborn for years. The physicians spoke of long-term institutionalization, medication regimens, and limited prognosis. Each word another crack in the perfect family portrait she had spent decades crafting. "We'll care for him at home," Mimi announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The lead psychiatrist exchanged glances with his colleagues, explaining the risks, the specialized care required, the potential danger to other family members. But Mimi had already made up her mind. Hidden Valley Road would become her son's sanctuary and prison. Don Galvin, summoned home from a military assignment, paced the hospital corridor, his military discipline crumbling under the weight of reality. "This isn't something you can fix with prayer and determination," he told his wife, voice low but sharp. "He needs professional help." Their argument echoed down the hallway, causing nurses to glance their way with practiced sympathy. Meanwhile, the telephone lines in their neighborhood hummed with speculation. The Galvin boy, wasn't he the bright one, the college student? Such a shame, they whispered. What could have happened in that house with all those children? The gossip spread like wildfire, each retelling more dramatic than the last. At home, Margaret fielded concerned calls from church members offering casseroles and prayers, her rehearsed responses becoming mechanical. "Mother appreciates your concern. Yes, Donald is receiving treatment. No, we don't need anything at the moment." Behind her practiced smile, she watched Lindsay's face grow paler with each conversation, both sisters silently wondering which brother might be next. Mimi transformed the guest bedroom into a makeshift sick room, hanging heavy curtains and removing anything breakable. She developed a system of schedules and routines, convinced that structure would anchor her son to reality. Each morning, she attended Mass, praying for a miracle while simultaneously planning for its absence. The diagnosis had ripped open the family's carefully maintained facade, exposing their vulnerability to medical scrutiny and neighborhood judgment. Yet Mimi remained resolute, her faith unshaken even as her world collapsed around her. Donald Jr. would come home, and no one, not doctors, not neighbors, not even her increasingly distant husband, would convince her otherwise. The first knock came on a Tuesday. Mimi Galvin opened the door to find a well-dressed man with a leather briefcase and university credentials. Dr. Robert Wilson introduced himself as a researcher studying familial patterns of mental illness. Behind her practiced smile, Mimi felt her world tilting. "We've heard about your family situation, Mrs. Galvin," he said gently. "Your son's cases represent a statistically significant anomaly that could help us understand the origins of schizophrenia." Within weeks, more researchers appeared. They sat at her immaculate kitchen table, requesting blood samples, family medical histories, and interviews with each child. They spoke of genetics, inheritance patterns, and scientific breakthroughs, words that made the chaos in her home sound clinical and distant. "Your family could help thousands," one researcher explained while examining Donald Jr.'s medical records. 6 cases of schizophrenia in one household is unprecedented in medical literature. Mimi clutched her rosary beads beneath the table. These strangers offered something she desperately needed: hope for answers, for treatment, for understanding why her perfect family had fractured. Yet each question felt like an invasion, each blood sample a betrayal of the privacy she had guarded fiercely for years. "We need to speak with your husband as well," Dr. Wilson mentioned casually. "Don is very busy with his military duties," she replied, the lie practiced and smooth. In truth, Don Galvin had become a ghost in his own home. His military career provided the perfect escape from the chaos he couldn't control. When home, he retreated to his study, the door firmly closed against the sounds of his disintegrating family. The rare dinners he attended were strained affairs, his silence heavier than any words. One evening, Margaret found her mother standing in the driveway long after Don had driven away. "He's not coming back tonight, is he?" the girl asked. Mimi straightened her shoulders. "Your father has important responsibilities." The younger children felt his absence like a physical pain. They watched the front door, ears straining for the sound of his car in the driveway. The older ones had stopped expecting anything at all. Between Don's abandonment and Mimi's suffocating vigilance, the Galvin children existed in an emotional wasteland. She monitored their every move, scrubbed away every trace of disorder, while he disappeared for days, returning with gifts, but never presents. The researchers continued their visits, collecting samples and stories. They promised confidentiality, but neighbors began to whisper. Scientific curiosity had pierced the protective bubble Mimi had built around her family's suffering. "We're making progress," Dr. Wilson assured her. "Your family's sacrifice won't be in vain." Mimi nodded politely, wondering what sacrifice meant to someone who hadn't watched half his children disappear into madness, while the other half learned to live in fear. The night the glass shattered, James Galvin's delusions reached a terrifying crescendo. His wife, Ellen, had been enduring his accusations for months, whispers about infidelity, paranoid theories about neighbors watching their home, suspicions that grew more elaborate each day. That evening, something in James snapped completely. "You've been letting them in," he screamed, hurling a framed wedding photo against the wall. Ellen backed away, tears streaming down her face as her husband's eyes grew wild, with a fury disconnected from reality. Margaret Galvin, 17 and already carrying the weight of her family's secrets, heard the commotion from downstairs. She rushed to Lindsay's room. Finding her 13-year-old sister frozen with fear, knees pulled to her chest. "Come with me," Margaret whispered, grabbing Lindsay's trembling hand. The sisters crept down the hallway as the sound of breaking dishes echoed through the house. They glimpsed Ellen fleeing through the front door, her face streaked with tears and a thin line of blood where glass had caught her cheek. James stood in the kitchen, breathing heavily, surrounded by destruction. When he turned and saw his sisters, something unrecognizable flashed in his eyes. "You're with them too," he muttered, advancing toward them. Margaret pushed Lindsay behind her, backing up slowly. "James, it's just us, your sisters." But her brother wasn't seeing family anymore, only threats. He lunged forward, grabbing a shard of broken plate from the counter. The girls turned and ran, Margaret shoving Lindsay into her bedroom and slamming the door. She dragged a heavy dresser across the entrance with strength born from pure adrenaline. James pounded against the door, his accusations becoming unintelligible howls. Inside, Margaret held Lindsay close on the bed, both trembling as the wood splintered under their brother's assault. "Where's Mom?" Lindsay whispered. "At church. Dad's on base." Margaret's voice was steady despite her terror. For 3 hours, they remained barricaded, listening as James eventually exhausted himself. The house fell into an eerie silence, broken only by distant sobbing from somewhere downstairs. When morning came, the smell of sweat and fear still hung in the air. The sisters emerged cautiously to find their mother scrubbing bloodstains from the kitchen floor, her face a mask of determination. James was gone, taken to the hospital after Ellen had called the police from a neighbor's house. Lindsay sat at the window later that day, watching birds fly freely above Hidden Valley Road. Her young face hardened with resolve. "I'm not staying here," she whispered to Margaret. "When I'm old enough, I'm leaving and never coming back." Margaret didn't argue. She simply squeezed her sister's hand, knowing that Lindsay's promise wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was survival. By 1965, Mimi Galvin's exhaustion had etched itself into every line of her face. Her once vibrant eyes now carried the dull sheen of perpetual fatigue as she drifted through the rooms of her Hidden Valley Road home, like a spectre. The hands that had once confidently cradled newborns were now raw and cracked from endless scrubbing, skin split open from the harsh chemicals she used to erase every imperfection from her increasingly imperfect world. "Just a little more bleach," she whispered to herself, attacking a barely visible mark on the kitchen counter. Her prayers had evolved into desperate mantras, whispered through clenched teeth as she worked. The rosary beads she kept in her apron pocket clicked softly with each movement, a rhythm that kept her grounded when everything else threatened to spin out of control. Don had been gone for 3 weeks on another military assignment. The house felt both emptier and more suffocating without him. His absence was yet another burden she carried, though she'd never admit how the weight of sole responsibility crushed her more with each passing day. The children needed stability. They needed someone to believe that order could still be restored. That afternoon, after sending Margaret to watch the younger ones, Mimi found herself alone in the kitchen. The rare moment of solitude hit her with unexpected force. She knelt to scrub at a stain beneath the refrigerator, one that had resisted her efforts for months. As she pressed the brush harder against the linoleum, something inside her finally broke. The tears came without warning, hot and relentless. 20 years of carefully maintained composure dissolved in seconds. Her shoulders shook with the force of her sobbing as she continued to scrub mechanically, unable to stop either action. Water and tears mixed with cleaning solution on the floor beneath her. "Mom!" Margaret's voice from the doorway froze her in place. Mimi wiped her face quickly with her sleeve. "Just finishing up in here," she said, her voice unnaturally bright. "The floor needed extra attention today." Her daughter's eyes, so much like her own once were, reflected understanding beyond her 15 years. Margaret nodded silently and backed away, allowing her mother the dignity of her facade. When the sound of her daughter's footsteps faded, Mimi rested her forehead against the cool surface of the refrigerator. Her sobs, though quieter now, echoed through the empty kitchen, a haunting soundtrack to the life she had lost, the perfect family she had dreamed of, the bright futures she had planned, the laughter that once filled these halls, all of it slipping through her raw, bleeding fingers no matter how tightly she tried to hold on. From the street, the Galvin residence on Hidden Valley Road remained a picture of American perfection, the lawn stretched like an emerald carpet, each blade of grass meticulously trimmed to uniform height. Hedges formed precise geometric shapes along the property line, while the stars and stripes of the American flag caught the Colorado breeze beside the freshly painted mailbox. Neighbors driving past would slow down, admiring what appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream. Behind this immaculate facade, however, the interior told a different story. Mimi Galvin had installed reinforced locks on bedroom doors after James's violent episode last spring. The living room windows had been replaced 3 times in the past year alone. Once after Donald Jr. had punched through the glass during a particularly severe delusion. Furniture disappeared regularly, either broken beyond repair during outbursts or quietly removed to create fewer projectiles during episodes. What visitors never saw was the house transforming into a containment facility. A fortress designed not to protect the family from outside dangers, but to keep their own chaos from spilling into public view. The contrast between exterior and interior mirrored the duality of their lives. In the backyard, where neighborhood children once gathered to watch the Galvins practice falconry, now stood empty bird cages, the hobby abandoned after too many incidents. The boxing equipment remained, though dusty and unused, since the brothers' sparring had escalated beyond sport into genuine violence. "Your garden looks absolutely divine this year," Mrs. Peterson from across the street commented one afternoon, catching Mimi deadheading roses. "I don't know how you manage it all with such grace." Mimi smiled, her practiced smile, gardening gloves hiding fingernails bitten to the quick. "Just a matter of routine," she replied, her voice steady, despite having spent the previous night separating two of her sons during a terrifying confrontation. The neighbors continued to marvel at her composure, how she still attended church every Sunday, hair perfectly set, clothes impeccably pressed. They whispered admiringly about her strength while remaining oblivious to the true nature of her struggles. None of them saw how she scrubbed bloodstains from carpets at midnight, or how she catalogued medications in a locked cabinet with military precision. Don Galvin had become a ghost in his own home, his military duties providing a convenient escape from the battlefield that his family life had become. His rare appearances felt like those of a visiting dignitary, formal, distant, and temporary. The Galvin house stood as a monument to appearances, its beautiful exterior masking the fractured reality within, a physical manifestation of the family's broader deception. Like the reinforced doors and replaced windows, Mimi's carefully constructed smile had become part of the fortress, another wall between their truth and the world outside. By the late 60s, the Galvin household had become a battlefield of broken promises and shattered minds. 3 more of the brothers, Matthew, Richard, and Peter, began exhibiting the same terrifying symptoms that had already claimed Donald Jr. and James. The pattern was undeniable now, a genetic curse that seemed to select its victims with cruel randomness. Each new diagnosis hit Mimi Galvin like a physical blow. She'd stand in church every Sunday, lips moving in desperate prayer, while her knuckles turned white from gripping the pew. "God has a plan," she'd whisper to herself, though her faith wavered more with each passing day. The house on Hidden Valley Road, once bustling with laughter and boyish energy, now echoed with screams and incoherent mumbling. Locks appeared on bedroom doors. Medication bottles lined the bathroom cabinet. Yet Mimi refused to consider institutionalization for all but the most severe cases, convinced she could manage through sheer force of will. "This family stays together," she'd declare during rare moments of calm, scrubbing already spotless countertops. "And we don't abandon our own." Don Galvin retreated further into his military duties, volunteering for assignments that kept him away for weeks at a time. When home, he'd sit silently in his study with a glass of whiskey, the weight of helplessness crushing his military posture. The discipline that had defined his life proved useless against an enemy he couldn't see or understand. "Dad's just another ghost in this house now," Margaret told Lindsay one night as they huddled together in their shared bedroom, the only sanctuary left in the chaotic household. The sisters, now teenagers, developed a silent language of glances and gestures that allowed them to navigate the unpredictable moods of their brothers. Margaret, nearly 18, had become a second mother, cooking meals when Mimi was overwhelmed and calming younger siblings during episodes of violence. Lindsay kept meticulous notes in a hidden journal, documenting patterns and triggers, determined to understand what was happening to her family. "Knowledge is our only weapon," she'd tell Margaret as they analyzed another incident. Their bond strengthened with each crisis. When Peter had a breakdown during dinner, hurling plates against the wall and accusing invisible enemies of poisoning his food, the sisters worked in perfect synchrony, Margaret distracting him while Lindsay quietly called the doctor. In those moments of chaos, with their mother frantically praying and their father absent, the sisters became each other's only constant. Their whispered conversations late at night became a lifeline, the only thing keeping them from drowning in the genetic tragedy consuming their brothers one by one. The manila folder landed on Mimi Galvin's kitchen table with a soft thud that somehow echoed through the entire house. Dr. Samuel Winters, a neurologist with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle voice, pointed to the charts inside, genetic markers, chromosomal patterns and statistical anomalies highlighted in yellow. 6 of your 12 children showing identical schizophrenic patterns, he explained. It's unprecedented in medical literature. Mimi's hands trembled as she closed the folder. For decades, she had blamed herself, her parenting, her discipline, her faith. Now science was telling her it had been in their blood all along, a genetic lottery that had cursed half her children before they'd even drawn their first breath. The year was 1972, and suddenly the Galvin family had become the most valuable research subjects in America. Universities called. Medical journals requested interviews. A team from Johns Hopkins arrived unannounced one Tuesday morning, equipment in hand, eager to meet the schizophrenia family. "They're not specimens," Mimi hissed at Don when he suggested cooperating with a prominent research hospital. Her husband stood by the window, military posture intact, despite the decades of chaos that had bent them both. "This could help other families," he countered, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Isn't that worth something?" Margaret found her mother later that evening, scrubbing the kitchen floor with such force the brush bristles were bending. "They want blood samples from all of us," the daughter said, kneeling beside her. "Even from me and Lindsay." The thought of her daughters being labelled, examined for the same genetic curse that had claimed their brothers, made Mimi's chest tighten. She had spent 27 years building walls between her family and the outside world. Now those walls were crumbling under the weight of scientific curiosity. When the research team arrived the following week, cameras and medical equipment in tow, James was having a particularly lucid day. He sat for their questions, rolled up his sleeve for blood draws, and even smiled for photographs. Donald Jr., however, refused to leave his room, screaming about government conspiracies and mind control. "This is exploitation," Mimi whispered to Margaret as they watched a researcher carefully label tubes of Galvin blood. The scientific paper published 6 months later sent shockwaves through the medical community. The Galvin case offered unprecedented insight into genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, a breakthrough that would eventually reshape treatment protocols nationwide. For the family on Hidden Valley Road, however, the revelation brought little comfort. Their private tragedy had become public property, their suffering transformed into data points and research grants. Mimi stood in her immaculate kitchen, staring at the newspaper headline that didn't even bother to protect their anonymity. "Colorado family holds key to schizophrenia mystery." The truth was out, and there was no scrubbing it away. Lindsay Galvin stared at the acceptance letter for the 3rd time that day, her fingers tracing the university's embossed letterhead. After years of hidden applications and secret study sessions, her escape plan was finally materializing. The full scholarship meant freedom, 3 states away from Hidden Valley Road and the suffocating weight of family secrets. The night before her departure, Lindsay methodically packed her suitcase in the bedroom she shared with Margaret. Each folded sweater and tucked-away book represented another step toward liberation. Her older sister sat cross-legged on her own bed, silent tears streaming down her face. "You could come with me," Lindsay whispered, though they both knew it was impossible. Margaret had become too entangled in the family's web of care and crisis. "Someone has to stay," Margaret replied, wiping her cheeks. "Mom can't handle it alone anymore." The sisters embraced, their bodies trembling with unspoken fears. They had been each other's shield against the chaos, Margaret protecting Lindsay from their brother's unpredictable episodes, Lindsay preserving Margaret's hope for a normal future. Now, their alliance was fracturing out of necessity. "Promise you'll call," Margaret said, pressing a small address book into Lindsay's palm. "Even if it's just to say you're okay." Lindsay nodded, unable to voice the truth, that sometimes survival meant cutting ties completely. The telephone in the hallway had become a conduit for bad news, and she wasn't sure she could bear hearing about another diagnosis, another hospitalization, another family breakdown. At 4 a.m, Lindsay shouldered her bag and crept down the stairs. The house creaked beneath her feet, as if protesting her departure. She paused at the kitchen doorway, startled to find Mimi sitting alone at the table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "And so you're really going," her mother said, her voice hollow. Lindsay nodded, clutching her bus ticket. "I have to." For a moment, Mimi looked like she might argue, might invoke duty or faith or family loyalty. Instead, she simply stood and straightened Lindsay's collar, a final maternal gesture. "Be careful out there," was all she said. As Lindsay walked down the driveway in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt the invisible cord connecting her to Hidden Valley Road stretching, thinning but not quite breaking. Behind her, the house stood silent, its windows like dark eyes watching her retreat. What Lindsay couldn't see was Mimi collapsing at the kitchen table after she left, or Margaret curling into a ball on her now empty sister's bed. She couldn't know that her departure would mark the final fracture in the family's already crumbling foundation. For Mimi Galvin, losing her youngest daughter meant losing the last thread of hope that had kept her perfect family illusion intact. The Galvin family, once the pride of Hidden Valley Road, had become a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors in Colorado Springs. Where neighbors once admired their large, seemingly perfect Catholic household, they now averted their eyes when passing the property. Scientists published papers with clinical detachment about the remarkable genetic anomaly present in the family. Doctors debated treatment protocols in sterile conference rooms, using the Galvins as case studies without truly understanding the human cost. But for Mimi Galvin, the only reality was the silence that settled over her house like a funeral shroud. The home that once echoed with the footsteps and laughter of 12 children now stood eerily quiet. Its halls haunted by memories both beautiful and painful. She wandered from room to room, straightening picture frames that needed no adjustment, dusting surfaces already clean. Don had retreated further into his military duties, finding solace in the predictable structure of command and routine. Their marriage had become a hollow shell, two people orbiting each other without connection. When he did come home, he spoke little, his eyes never quite meeting hers across the dinner table. Mimi clung to her routines with desperate intensity. She polished floors that would never shine the same, scrubbing at invisible stains as if she could erase the past. Her hands, once soft and elegant, had grown calloused and rough from years of fighting an invisible enemy with nothing but cleaning products and prayer. The rosary beads she clutched each night were worn smooth from constant handling. On Sundays, she still prepared a roast, setting the table with her fine china as if expecting a full house. The empty chairs stood as silent accusations. She clutched at memories of laughter that now felt like a distant dream, Christmas mornings before the darkness descended, summer picnics when her children still played without fear. Margaret called once a week, her voice careful and measured, never mentioning Lindsay, who had disappeared into her new life without looking back. The sisters' bond had stretched thin across the distance, weighed down by shared trauma and divergent paths. The cost of secrecy, control, and unyielding love was written in the empty seats around her dinner table. Mimi's faith, once her foundation, offered little comfort now. She knelt in church, lips moving in practiced devotion, while her heart screamed questions no priest could answer. Why had God chosen her family? What sin had merited such punishment? At night, she sat alone with photo albums spread before her, tracing the faces of her children with trembling fingers, searching for signs she might have missed, warnings she should have heeded. The weight of what-ifs pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, growing heavier with each passing day. In the end, Mimi Galvin sat alone in her once perfect home, surrounded by photographs that captured moments frozen in time. Her weathered hands traced the smiling faces of her 12 children in gilt frames, faces that had once filled Hidden Valley Road with laughter and life. The house that had witnessed both triumph and tragedy now stood as a silent testament to her relentless pursuit of normalcy. She often lingered in the kitchen, the heart of what she had once believed would be her perfect American family. The countertops gleamed from decades of obsessive cleaning, yet no amount of scrubbing could erase the memories etched into every corner. Sometimes, in the quiet afternoons, she imagined she could still hear the thundering footsteps of her boys racing down the hallway, or the whispered secrets between Margaret and Lindsay before the darkness descended. Don had retreated further into himself over the years, his military precision no match for the chaos that had engulfed their lives. Their marriage had become a hollow shell, two people bound by shared tragedy rather than love. When he passed away, Mimi felt not grief, but a strange, guilty relief, one less witness to their family's unraveling. Scientists continued to study the Galvin bloodline, their home becoming a footnote in medical textbooks. Researchers spoke of genetic markers, hereditary patterns, and breakthrough treatments developed from studying her children. 6 of her sons had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, an unprecedented concentration that transformed private suffering into public fascination. The family that had once hidden behind closed doors became America's most significant case study in mental illness. Lindsay had built a life far from Colorado, calling home just often enough to ease her conscience. Margaret had stayed closer, carrying the weight of her brother's care after Mimi could no longer manage alone. The sisters' bond, forged in childhood fear, had evolved into something complicated by distance and resentment. On rare occasions when the family gathered, the absences spoke louder than those present. Empty chairs represented those lost to institutions, estrangement, or early death. Conversations carefully navigated around painful topics, creating an intricate dance of avoidance that everyone knew by heart. The Galvin legacy lived on in medical journals and whispered neighborhood legends. Their story challenged the myth of the perfect American family, revealing how easily the facade of normalcy could shatter. In the end, their greatest contribution wasn't scientific but human, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't strangers lurking in shadows, but the secrets carried within our own blood, passed silently from one generation to the next.